Assalamu alaikum, program Perspectives, and I'm your host Ghulam Rabi Morai. Viewers, we discuss a subject or a topic in depth from various perspectives in this program. As usual, Syed Mohibullah Shah, a writer and intellectual, is with us. Shah Sahab, Assalamu alaikum. Shah Sahab, today's topic is virtual democracy. Okay? And my first question is, what is virtual democracy and how it is different from the real democracy?
Okay, Morai sahab.
I've thrown the ball in your court. Now you treat this ball whatever way you like.
Okay. Now, virtual democracy and how is it different from real democracy? Now, that's a very, very serious, very important question. And many people in many different countries are really grappling with this issue because a lot of different versions of democracy have been propagated or practiced in different countries, which are not real democracies. In some countries, there has been a basic democracy. In some countries, there have been guided democracy. In some countries, there has been sham democracy. In some countries, there has been trickle-down democracy, different versions of it. In some countries, there have been rubber democracies. Now, this is the 21st century high-tech version of democracy. This high-tech 21st century version of democracy is called virtual democracy. Now, virtual democracy, why is it called? Because like virtual reality, it looks like democracy, but it does not have the soul of democracy. The essence of democracy is lacking. That is why it is called virtual democracy, and this is a practice, unfortunately, in many countries. Asia, in Africa, and in South America. Now, there are some peculiar features of this virtual democracy in different countries. For instance, it says that, those who practice this, who are supporting it, they say that, this is a version of democracy, or they say this is democracy because it meets the requirements of people. But when people touch it or try to feel it, they don't feel an ownership of that democracy. So they don't feel an attachment that this is working for them. Okay? Then, for instance, as we say, if you look at the elephants, then the tusks of the elephants which are visible, people see the tusks of the elephant, but actually there are other teeth which are used for eating. So like virtual democracy also, on the front, to show there are different leaders, but like the real teeth of the elephants, there are other leaders who are not visible. They really run this so-called democracy, but like a virtual reality, on the front, there are others. You can see them first. So this is something, and because of that, it is something which is causing a gap between the rulers and the ruled. Because the people do not feel that they have ownership. They do not feel this is our own institution, And therefore this gap is there. And this gap is now in many countries that can be seen. As I said, different labels have been given in the past also, and now this kind of a thing is there. Now, what is a real democracy, for instance, as you asked? What will be the main features of real democracy? I would think, if I were to sum up because that can be many things we can talk about, but at least there are 5 main features of a real democracy that they should be there. And if they don't exist in a system or in a country, it means it may be any other kind of a democracy, the names which I first mentioned, including a virtual democracy, but it's not a real democracy. And so what are the main criteria for a real democracy? 1, that it must recognize the ownership of people over the state. That the state is owned by the people. That's the first thing. Nobody else is the master. The people of any country, the people of a country are the sovereign owners of that state. 1. Number 2, the rulers and the ruled are subject to the same law. There are no different laws for rulers and another set of law for the ruled. So that second point is equality of treatment. Everybody is equal before the law, whether you are a ruler or you are the ruled one. 2. 3. Everybody has same rights, whether you are ruler or whether you are ruled. But those who are the rulers, they have greater duties, responsibilities. Rights are equal, but responsibilities and duties of those who have authority, those who are rulers, they have greater responsibility than ordinary man. He has no power. So power and responsibility go together. Rights are the same. A peasant, a farmer, and an ordinary worker, a citizen, has same rights as the prime minister or any leader of a country. But the prime minister has greater duty, greater obligation than an ordinary fellow, than an ordinary citizen. Then, now in other words, this is called the rule of law, for instance, that everybody is subject to the rule. It should be a rule of law in the country, not law of the ruler. There's a difference between the two. Rule of law is in a real democracy. Rule of law is in the real democracy. Law of the ruler is in virtual democracy. Whoever is the ruler, he issues his own laws, his own will, his own wishes, his own whims. So, another difference between the real and virtual democracy is that in the real democracy, a rule of law prevails. In virtual democracy, the law of the ruler prevails, the other way. So, and then of course, in this game between rulers and the ruled, between those who govern and those who are governed, there should be a watchdog. There should be somebody who is independent and is able to point out if anyone commits mistake or violates the code of conduct. Now, that code of conduct can be called the constitution of a country, for instance. That's a code of conduct. Now, this watchdog is generally an independent free press. So now we found that if you are talking of a real democracy, it should have 5 features. One, it should accept the ownership of people. 2, it should believe that the ruler and the ruled have same rights. 3, that the rulers have greater responsibility than the ruled. 4th, that real democracy means rule of law prevailing in society. A virtual democracy means law of the ruler prevailing. Whoever is the ruler, he says, okay, this is how you behave. New laws or new ordinances are issued. They don't, this is the other thing. And then there should be an independent, free press as a watchdog over it. There should be free, independent judiciary as a watchdog also. So there should be a free and independent watchdog. These 5 features, if they are there, you can say this country has a real democracy. If these are absent, then whatever be the name, they may be called basic democracy, sham democracy, guided democracy, rubber democracy, trickle-down democracy, but it is not a real democracy. Hence we say that the 21st century high-tech version, there is a new discovery, a new name given, which is called the virtual democracy, and that is the difference between virtual and the real democracy.
We'll meet after break. Welcome back. Shah Sahab, in the first part, you explained the difference between real democracy, and virtual democracy. Now, let our viewers know what are the critical features where real democracy is violated.
Now, let me begin with a historical quote. This is attributed to Soviet Union's dictator Stalin. And because, elections in Soviet Union were generally manipulated, controlled. As we said, in the real democracy, one first feature is that there should be ownership of the people, which should be accepted, and that ownership of the people is expressed through free, independent, and transparent elections. But Stalin, and in many other countries, Asia, Africa, South America, elections are controlled. When you are saying which is a critical factor, I would say that the most critical factor is how the will of the people is violated through controlled elections. That is the main feature. There are other features too, but one of the main features is the very first principle of a real democracy is that it is owned by people and it expresses the will of the people expressed through free, fair, and transparent elections. Now, the very first principle is violated, and that is one of the critical factors. Now, a famous quote has been attributed to Soviet Union's dictator Stalin, because these elections were manipulated in order to get what is in Pakistan called positive elections, positive results, as one of the dictators of Pakistan had said. Now, Stalin says, this is a very strange quotation. Stalin says, it does not matter how many people vote. This is a quotation from Stalin. It does not matter how many people vote, only who counts them. What matters is those who count. I think there's here In Pakistan, the last elections, there is a big tussle going on between
From
45
45,
and
47.
47. Okay. Now this is Stalin, 70 years ago, 80 years
This is
ago.
the role of the people who count.
See, he says it doesn't matter. It does not matter how many people vote. Only who counts the votes. And in the last elections, I think everybody, media, television, newspapers, politicians of all kinds, they're all talking about it. So, a real democracy, one of the critical factors would violate the principle of real democracy is having non-transparent, non-free, and non-fair elections. That is the starting point. Then it becomes controlled, then whether you can control democracy or sham democracy or a trickle-down democracy and all kinds of versions. From there, then in order to see that the will of the people is violated by different tactics. There have been, over the years, the last 70, 80 years, there have been different tactics used. How to violate or vitiate the will of the people, how not to have honest or transparent elections. There are different tactics which have been used by different kinds of people, different governments. Now, what it does is, it's a serious thing because it affects the whole society. Because when your starting point is like this, that in order to support it, in order to propagate that no, this is all right and there has been no vitiating the will of the people, then you create whole culture of hypocrisy and lies. And this whole society then adopts this culture. And the wrong is not considered the wrong. Then dishonesty is not considered a bad thing. Cheating is not considered a bad thing. Tampering with the will of the people is not considered a bad thing. It creates a culture in society where it is very difficult to distinguish between what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is false. Now, when you create such a society, then it affects your other things also. Then this culture then pervades into your economic life, into social life, into systems of governance. So you're changing the culture of society, and therefore, let us say, you create two kinds of people. Another principle of real democracy now being violated means the rulers and the rules become very different. Those who are ruled can go and vote, but their votes will not be counted by the rulers, whoever are the rulers. So you create the difference between rulers and the ruled. And therefore, equality of law is also violated. The rulers are not subject to the same law as it applies to the ruled persons. You see the kind of society that is being created, because the starting point is an act of dishonesty. And therefore, in order to continue with it, you have to carry very different other features, and it permeates throughout the society. So your various guidelines or various features of real democracy are then vitiated starting from one point. So there is no equality between the rulers. So we said the real democracy means rulers and the ruled have same rights, and the rulers have a greater responsibility, because authority and responsibility go together. Now, when you have this system, it makes a distinction between ruler and the ruled. For instance, there are two classes, different laws for different people. If you remember, there's a very famous book that was written some times ago by Orwell, George Orwell, called The Animal Farm. Now, The Animal Farm is another. It has been a historical, it's a very classic, it's a very small book, but it's a very classic
Animal Farm.
Animal Farm. And one of the main quotations, one sentence from Animal Farm was generally quoted everywhere in the world for almost, now for decades. The Animal Farm also, the author, he says that in the Animal Farm, there are two kinds of people. Now, we are talking of virtual democracy. You can see the virtual democracy and Animal Farm, something common between the two. He says in Animal Farm, all animals are equal. In virtual democracy, we were talking earlier, that appearance is that all are equal. That's it. Like virtual reality, it's there. They are all equal. In Animal Farm says, George Orwell, that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. See? Now you try and see this. Now this is the great wisdom. This is why it's a classic now. He said this decades ago. In fact, he worked here in India during the time when India was a colony of East India Company and Britain. So he worked here for some time, and quite possibly
He worked with the animals.
he worked probably, he learned a lot probably from working, seeing the conditions in India. Then he went back and then he wrote this book. He also wrote the other book, 1984, another classic. But we're talking here of the Animal Farm, and that it's interesting that he observed and imbibed the conditions of rulers and the ruled, the difference between them. And maybe he was a sensitive person who could appreciate that here are rulers, there are different laws for them, here are the ruled who are different from them, there are different kinds of people. So he said, okay, that in the Animal Farm, there are two kinds of animals. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. In virtual democracy also, it pretends that all people are equal. But in reality, some are more equal than others. The rulers are more equal than others. Rulers have greater rights, greater privileges, less duty, less responsibility than the ordinary citizens. So therefore, you could find some similarity between Animal Farm of George Orwell and the virtual democracy that we see in many countries in the 21st century.
Let's take a break. Welcome back. Shah Saab, how can the virtual democracy be brought to closer to the real democracy in developing countries?
Yes. Now, sorry, Morai sir, the fruits of democracy will only come to the people when the features of real democracy are practiced. That is why the name is wonderful. Everybody accepts there should be democracy. And even those who violate every principle of democracy, even they say, no, this is a democracy. Now, whether it is a sham democracy or a guided democracy or a controlled democracy or a virtual democracy, but they use the name of democracy because There is no escape. The whole world says you cannot have a system other than a democratic system. But there are some people in these countries where they don't want real democracy, but they want to keep the label of democracy, a facade, but really violate and vitiate it for their own purposes. Now, what we see, if we analyze this over many countries, see, normally in the democratic system, there are internal and external checks and balances to see that the system is not violated, that the fundamental principles of democracy are not violated. Now, again, there are so many features, but we'll talk about some. Democracy, let us say, democratic governance is very different from, let us say, the rule between ruling a country, let us say. If there was a Mughal empire or there was a British empire here in India say a few hundred years ago, or in other countries, there were rulers. They ruled the country as autocrats, as all power to themselves. But in a democratic system, power is diffused horizontally and vertically. Horizontally, power is shared and diffused between executive, legislature, and judiciary. The power of a state is distributed horizontally in these main institutions. Then power is also distributed vertically. There may be a prime minister, a minister, or there may be a secretary, or their director general, or a director, or a section officer. The virtual, each one has its own power and authority. For instance, let us take local examples. In the administration, now it's violated in the administration, for instance, in the revenue department. We are giving an easy example people can understand, for instance. In the revenue department, for instance, okay, there is a commissioner, he has powers, there is a minister and there is a chief minister above, okay. But there is a deputy commissioner, there is a mukhtiarkar, and there is, let us say, a tapedar. Each one has a designated role and function and powers given to it. The powers of a tapedar, for instance, cannot be used by the deputy commissioner. He can overrule, he can hear the appeals, but fundamentally basic power has to be used by that or by a mukhtiarkar. Or if there is a district magistrate as a deputy commissioner, his power of a deputy commissioner or exercising as a district magistrate cannot be taken, and the chief minister of a province cannot act as a district magistrate. He can overrule, but the power has to be first exercised at that particular level. The point I am saying is that the power is distributed virtually from top to bottom and is also distributed horizontally. So the power is shared. In democratic governance, power is shared. Power is not concentrated in anyone, neither in parliament, nor in the executive. As I said, I gave examples of the executive, from prime minister or minister or a chief minister to commissioner to deputy commissioner to tehsildar and down below. Similarly, say in the police department or in engineering, every functionary has a designated job and powers and function assigned to it. His superior can overrule him, but his superior cannot take away these powers. He cannot act. So now this is the one fundamental thing. Now we have abolished it more or less in Pakistan. But if you go abroad, anybody going abroad will realize and see this, that the function of a lower functionary cannot be taken away by the minister of that department. That lower functionary has to exercise his power. Only when it is wrong in an appeal it can be changed. But a minister, let's say in a secretary or minister equivalent in America or in Europe or in Canada, cannot say, okay, sorry, I will exercise this power of an inspector or a sub-inspector or equivalent to whatever is equivalent to a Mukhtar Khan. Cannot do this. Or an immigration officer. Many people will say, your immigration officer, a clerk who exercises the decision, a minister cannot act as that immigration clerk, cannot do this. He has to exercise that power. Then he can be overruled if it is wrong. Point is, so there is the sharing, diffusion of power in democracy. In countries like Pakistan, this is like this revival of the Mughal kingdom. The big boss has all the powers. He can take away the powers of the lower functionaries. Undemocratic, violating. So this power in a democracy is shared. Sorry. And you cannot violate those rules. There's a lot more, but now I remember now a very important example, a real life example. And I think I'd rather tell this to people. They can learn a lot of lessons from it. Then there are other things also one could say if the time is there. Now, I want to give an example of a democratic country and how a leader of a democratic country is subject to law of the country. He cannot violate the laws and the rules of a country. Now you can compare this with the conduct in Pakistan. In 1990, when I was working with Prime Minister Benazir Sahib, the government of Japan gave a loan of 3 billion yen to Pakistan for some projects. Now, I was in charge of that particular activity, so I wrote this letter to all the federal ministries and all the 4 provincial governments. Okay, please recommend, suggest important projects. This is the loan available. Now send this project by certain date, because the government of Japan had said, okay, by this date we should get it. As is the usual in Pakistan, time is not respected. So, after sending 1 or 2 reminders also, then finally projects came, and finally 6 projects were selected by the cabinet. But the time had passed away.
Oh my God.
Limited time. Mm-hmm. So I sent this to the government of Japan, to Tokyo. What had happened was that the Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Kefu, by that time, he had left Japan on a visit to Indonesia, and from Indonesia, he was then coming to Pakistan. So anyway, when they landed in Pakistan at Islamabad airport, I was mainly worried because, the Prime Minister said, we want this, occasion. Now the Prime Minister of Japan is here, and we want those 6 projects approved in his presence. So when the plane landed and, after receiving formality protocol, the most important man after the Prime Minister there in Japan is the Cabinet Secretary, very important man. And he was the, let's say, my counterpart. So when they arrived at Islamabad airport, I went to see him. I got hold of him. I said, you and I have to discuss. Tomorrow morning, there is a formal meeting between the 2 prime ministers. So he and we sat in the same car from airport going to Islamabad city to discuss the agenda for tomorrow's meeting. So I told him, apart from other atoms, there is this particular atom which our Prime Minister will be talking to your Prime Minister that you have given us this loan of 3 billion yen. Thank you very much. And these are our 6 projects. And we hope that the Prime Minister of Japan will give the approval in this meeting. And then there will be joint press conference and the 2 Prime Ministers can announce. And Pakistanis will be very happy. This is the gesture of the government of Japan. He said, Mr. Shah, our Prime Minister cannot do this. I said, why? He said, this money is not a personal money of Prime Minister of Japan that he can award the way he likes. This money belongs to the people of Japan. And people of Japan have laid down certain rules and procedures that if a project comes, whether our project or from a foreign government, it has to be shaped under the parameters whether it meets the objective for which we are giving the money. And that procedure cannot be bypassed by the Prime Minister. He has no authority. So your project did not come in time. If they had come in time, our people would have processed it. Whether it is the clerics or the officials or the experts or whoever, their power cannot be taken away by the Prime Minister. And since they had not examined this and they had not completed their job and given a report that these projects are good and they meet the objectives for which the money is being given, only then the Prime Minister can say, yes, but now Prime Minister has no authority to overrule that, nor can he cut short the procedure. Okay. Now compare this. Japan is a rich country, a democratic country. This is how the Prime Minister of Japan is subject to the rules and regulations. Now you compare that with what is happening in Pakistan. How the public money is distributed. Development grants, you do what you like, all discretionary funds. No discretion to the Prime Minister of Japan, of a democratic country. The same thing in England also, same thing in other countries. So these are internal checks and balances. Developed democracies observe it. The virtual democracy violates it.
Thank you, Shah Sahab. Goodbye.